Hi class, my name is Jacob Miranda and welcome to my research presentation. For my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about Shantytown in BioShock Infinite. Now, before I even start, I wanted to go ahead and just introduce myself pretty quickly. I saw that someone else had done this in their presentation too, and I just wanted to also do that because I feel like a lot of us, thanks to the pandemic, have had most of our schedules moved online. And if not fully moved online, maybe just like one or two classes are in person. And I feel like the part that we miss the most is just meeting each other. Obviously, though, this is a web-based class, so regardless, we might have ended up never meeting each other anyways, but I still think it'd be nice to give an introduction. Especially because I feel like we've grown accustomed to reading each other's names off the discussion boards, but names just become words when you don't really know who's behind that name. So I'll go ahead and do the basic college introduction. My name is Jacob Miranda. I'm 18 years old. I'm a criminal justice major, and it's my junior year, I believe. Now, with that said, I've actually already done most of my gen eds, and so I'm taking this class purely as an elective. And the reason for that is because I had a friend who was also taking this and told me that in the course materials, there was going to be a video game in the class. And that very much intrigued me because two of the things I like to do anyways, just for leisure, is read books and play video games. And I feel like quite often we're assigned books in classes, but being assigned games was definitely out of the ordinary, and so I was definitely interested. My interest only grew more when I ended up finding out that it was even focused on the dystopian genre, because the dystopian genre is probably my favorite genres, especially with video games specifically, because one of my favorite games that I've played was Fallout 4, which was a dystopian game, and I found actually has a lot of parallels with BioShock. I think the dystopian genre in general is just sort of interesting because it really takes almost the real world and just turn something up all the way, and will like pull from the past and will show how bad things were and how bad things could become if blank happens, right? So starting on with my presentation, I wanted to start with just my initial thoughts on BioShock Infinite. I really love having a speaking protagonist. After playing the first BioShock, I hadn't realized that it was something that I missed, but it definitely is something that I enjoy having. Especially because I even feel like in modern games now, we still don't often get protagonists who speak. And I think it makes it maybe not more immersive, but more interesting because you don't necessarily feel like the character because they are speaking on their own. But you definitely pay more attention because the character is now its own character, if that makes sense. I've also really come to enjoy the story and the complexities of it overall. In general, the BioShock world seems really interesting with BioShock and Infinite having both been played. Obviously, we haven't finished Infinite, but with how much we've played, both worlds seem so interesting. Interesting enough that I think once this course ends, I'm going to go back and play BioShock 2. And overall, what's most important, in my opinion, when it comes to story-based video games is an immersive world. And BioShock Infinite definitely does not lack that. In my opinion, what creates an immersive world is a world in which you remember parts of it quite specifically. Especially because I feel like most video games are just going from point A to point B. And so making that space between, or the places between, memorable is really important. Examples of this I can think of are like in Fallout 4, one of my favorite games, obviously I've already mentioned. There was Diamond City, which was a city that was built inside of a baseball stadium, which created a memorable world. You mentioned that game and I immediately think of that part of the world. And honestly, we could even step away from the dystopian genre, right? And let's move to something like Zelda Breath of the Wild. The world is almost its own character in that game, and that's what makes it so good. And it's really important that a world is like almost living and breathing in video games because that's what makes you feel as if you're in the world. And BioShock definitely does not lack that, and especially when we get to Shantytown. Shantytown is obviously the company town run by Fink, and speaking of company towns, I think it's time that we familiarize ourselves with that term. Now starting off, what are company towns? Company towns are often just towns, as they sound, built around the company's main source of income, which is often a mine or a factory. They're created usually in order to give workers easy access to their job. And it's actually almost ironic because obviously factories and mines have to build far away from housing because they need a lot of space. But then the problem ends up becoming, well, how are the workers going to get here? So they go, oh, let's just build our own town. But obviously, I think you can imagine where the problems start to come from this, especially because the prominence of company towns typically comes back when America was more territorial and the government didn't necessarily have control over everywhere. And so companies would go ahead and build towns and they'd say, oh, well, we're providing housing, so we can take the rent from their checks, right? And then they'd even continue on and go so far as to say, well, we already built houses, let's build stores too, right? We'll build commissaries for the employees where they can take the money that they earned from us and give it back to us. And I think you start to see how disastrous of a situation that can be, because if you are a worker in these worker towns and company towns, you end up getting stuck in a loop and a cycle of drowning in debt. Because ultimately, if the company has control of your housing, of your food, of your job, everything, what can you do? And quite often we actually see these company towns in American history. Obviously I have these examples listed on the screen, but we can even kind of stretch it out, right? We go to UNLV. Here in Nevada, we had examples of those too. When Hoover Dam was being built, there was a lot of housing. A lot of people moved here in order to build that. Now, obviously, conditions weren't necessarily as bad because I'm not sure that the companies were in control of it as much, but there definitely was a better way of living. And so going with examples of company towns that we've seen in American history, we have Lowell, Massachusetts, Pullman, Illinois, and one that I think we quite often don't realize started off as a company town, Hershey, Pennsylvania. Lowell, Massachusetts was founded early in the 19th century. It was a major source for textile manufacturing, and thanks to that, it was built near a giant waterfall, and the reason for that was that the water helped power these factories. And then what actually makes Lowell really interesting is it was one of the first prominent times that women were offered jobs in America, and these girls ended up actually becoming known as mill girls. Now, giving an overview, it almost sounds promising, right? Like it's like, oh, it was a nice company town. But ultimately it wasn't, because oftentimes these girls were pulled from the surrounding rural areas and were taken in. And then after being taken in, were being paid $2, which was just enough to pay for their housing. Along with that, the textile factory had complete control over their schedule, because obviously they live in the city, right? And so they have control of when you wake up, when you go to work. Which I guess the company having control of when you go to work isn't too weird, but the idea that they can control when you wake up just because you live there is something else. And this is where we begin to see why giving companies full control over their employees' living situation really creates bad situations. Next, we have Pullman, Illinois, which had a factory which was built for the production of luxury railroad cars. And so the reason George Pullman had even decided to build a community around his factory was obviously so workers had easy access, but also because this community had a positive outview in which it was going to attract hard workers, and it was going to lead away from that big city life and bring in only the most elite class of workers. Although, as we know, not all bad ideas start out as bad ideas. This, in the beginning, sounded like a really good idea, a place for people to come in and work hard, but the issue was, who defines working hard? The person who defined working hard was George Pullman. He had all the power in that town, and he was even able to evict people without notice. And because he was so focused on working hard, he had banned basic things that most people would maybe not need but want, such as saloons. He wanted to make sure everyone was working so hard that there was no room for leisure, and then the people working in these factories had no choice but to work. Especially because if you weren't working to the standard that was thought to be fit for this community, you could be evicted without notice and you would have nothing to do about it. And again, this is just a common thing that we're going to see when looking into company towns. It's scary because when a company becomes its own government, there really is nothing stopping them. And the final example of a company town that we're going to look at is Hershey, Pennsylvania. Now, Hershey, as opposed to the last two we looked at, actually had a variety of homes, and workers had the choice to either buy or rent them. Now, obviously, yeah, you have the choice to buy or rent them. Your income is still decided by the company, and so ultimately, are you going to buy it or are you going to rent it? What is the point? But obviously, this was like some crazy chocolate wonderland, so they even had streets named Chocolate and Cocoa Avenue. And so once again, this sounds really promising. Unlike the other one, there's various housing options with different opportunities. There's these fun little street names, but there's also their own police. Hershey was pressing very hard into policing their own employees, which would be one thing if it was when they were on the clock, but specifically, they tried to police their citizens off the clock. Imagine if every waking moment of your life was controlled by your employer. There's no good to that. There is no positive to that. And what became prominently known was that the higher-ups would often play favorites, especially with raises and advances in the company. And so it created a very toxic environment in Hershey where people were kissing up to bosses because realistically they needed to. Not only for the sake of raises, but for the fact that when you're off the clock, your life is being controlled by them. And so obviously we see this quite a lot in company towns, and in BioShock Infinite, it's no different, which is why what's known as a company town ends up becoming known as a shantytown. Now, shantytowns are another term that we should familiarize ourselves with. It's a town or area that lacks infrastructure and is made up of shanties and shacks that are housing for those who live there. Typically in a shantytown, your housing, the reason it lacks infrastructure is because you're using mud and just other, broken materials from the factories in order to build your house. And so now we've gone through all these examples and focused on the terms of company towns, shanty towns. We've seen how horrible the living conditions were for those in those company towns, the lack of benefits they received, the fact they were treated almost not human. The question now is, how does this relate to BioShock Infinite? Immediately, I think where we should start is with Jeremiah Fink. See, what Jeremiah Fink has is something that Lowell has, something Hershey has, something Pullman has. And that is that they are ambitious men who are looking for their gain. They are looking for ways in which that they can improve their company and make more money. Although the one difference with Jeremiah Fink is that we're in a video game, and so everything is turned up all the way. Jeremiah Fink is one of the richest and therefore one of the most powerful men in Colombia. He created Fink Manufacturing, and to sum it all up, he's the embodiment of that extreme capitalist, right? When you picture in your head like the evil capitalists, you think of Jeremiah Fink. And so looking at Jeremiah Fink and knowing that he created Fink Manufacturing, you would assume that those who work under him are not being treated well. And that assumption would be extremely correct, which is why what is officially named the factory worker housing that he controls ends up becoming vandalized and being known as Shantytown. See, these workers who live in this factory worker housing are paid through company tokens, which can only be used in the company store. See, in real life American company towns, it was bad enough that the money went back to the company, but in BioShock, they're being paid through tokens that can only be given back to the company. Along with that, I mentioned ideas of your schedule fully being controlled by your company. In BioShock, the workers that lived in the shantytown would work 12-hour days, which would often leave workers extremely tired. And considering how valueless those tokens were, it's no surprise that the workers had to resort to eating rats and vandalizing vending machines. It's extremely sad, really. You know, for how demented this BioShock world really is, Shantytown is one of the few moments that's genuinely just sad. Because it's not even like these citizens have gone crazy, they've just been put in a situation where they can't get out. They're in a company town, there's nothing they can do. And so a big question now is, why did BioShock Infinite reference these towns through the creation of Shantytown, right? Like, obviously Shantytown is just a part of this game, but clearly there were references to the real life, and you have to ask why. Now, I think the reason they referenced it is the same reason most dystopian stories reference anything, and that's, we can see how horrible the future can become by looking at the past. We see that if we take things to an extreme, if we take company towns to an extreme, it could go just as horribly as it did before. If we don't learn from our mistakes, they just happen to repeat themselves. And although obviously this sounds very extreme, and it is very much to the extremes for an obvious reason, it is still something important to think about, because not so long ago, actually just in February here in Nevada, a bill was being looked over that would give tech companies an opportunity to govern themselves. The opportunity to govern themselves essentially lets them create company towns once more, and if they're governing themselves and they're acting as a county, we can see how horribly it would go.